When I walked into the kitchen that morning, the sun spilling gold across the counters and the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls lingering in the air, I froze, because there she was, my best friend, sitting across from Mark, my husband, leaning a little too close, her laughter spilling like music over his words, and something inside me cracked in a way I had never felt before. I gripped the edge of the counter until my hands trembled and my knuckles burned, and I could hear the children laughing upstairs, a sound that should have brought warmth, but instead it felt distant and foreign, as if it belonged to someone else's home, someone else's life. And I wanted to run. I wanted to grab Emma and Liam and vanish into the quiet of the street outside. But my feet refused to move and my throat tightened until I could barely whisper. And all I could do was watch the life I thought I knew unravel in front of me and wonder how I had missed it. All the signs, the whispers, the little glances that suddenly made sense in a cruel twist of reality. Before that morning, life had felt ordinary, predictable, safe. Mark would wake early to make breakfast for the kids, the smell of coffee and toast drifting through the rooms. Emma with her curly hair falling into her eyes and Liam tugging on his socks while he argued about cereal boxes. It was our little dance, our rhythm of mornings that had always grounded me. I worked from home part-time, managing freelance projects which allowed me to attend parent-teacher meetings and the occasional soccer game. The walls of our house were painted warm beige and soft yellow. Sunlight always made the living room glow, and I had thought I knew our life intimately. Every laugh, every sigh, every whispered secret we shared seemed eternal. It started slowly at first, little things I had shrugged off, a late night here, an unexpected meeting there, a text that I thought was from a coworker but left a strange residue in my mind, a feeling of unease that I tried to push aside, pretending that I was imagining it, trying to be the supportive wife, the understanding partner, the woman who trusts the people she loves. And I told myself I was overthinking it until I began noticing patterns that could no longer be dismissed. Mark would come home smelling faintly of perfume that was not mine. The quick glance at his phone when I entered the room, the sudden excuses to leave the house alone at odd hours, and always she would appear at the periphery of my life. Always my friend who knew too much, who smiled too warmly when our lives crossed, who lingered in ways that felt intimate and wrong. And I began to realize that the life I had cherished was not what it seemed. The day I discovered the truth, I was trying to bake cookies with Emma, a simple Saturday morning ritual, when I saw the message on Mark's phone light up across the counter. I should have looked away, but I couldn't, my curiosity pulling me forward. The words on the screen burned into my vision. "I cannot stop thinking about you," she had written. My stomach twisted as the world collapsed around me, and I watched Emma stir the dough, unaware of the tremor in my hands. And for a moment, I wondered if I should confront him then or wait, if I should run or stay, if I could even breathe without breaking apart. And then I remembered the laughter, the touches, the way she leaned too close, and the truth hit me with the force of a storm. They were together. They had been together, and I had been blind. I confronted him later in the afternoon, the kids in their rooms playing quietly, oblivious to the tension that filled the air. The sunlight falling in shafts across the floor as he tried to explain, trying to apologize, trying to make sense of what could not be made sense of. His words stumbled and faltered, my voice shook as I asked the questions I had rehearsed in the bathroom mirror for nights on end. And the answers were raw and unfiltered, full of shame and longing, full of betrayal and desire. And I felt the weight of it crushing me, pressing down into my chest like stones. And yet I also felt an odd clarity, a sharp focus, as if for the first time I could see everything as it was, not as I wished it to be. I spent that evening alone in the living room, the quiet interrupted only by the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator, thinking about the choices I had to make, the life I wanted to protect, the children who depended on me for safety and love, and the woman who had been my friend and was now my enemy in ways I had never imagined. And I knew then that I had to find a way to survive the betrayal, to protect my family, to find a path through the wreckage without losing myself in the process. The next few days were a blur of motion and silence at the same time, the kids following their routines with innocent energy and Mark moving through the house like a ghost, his presence familiar yet tainted. I went through the motions of breakfast, school drop-offs, playdates, and laundry, while my mind spun endlessly on what had happened. I would catch glimpses of him and my stomach would twist. And yet I had to speak to him, I had to see the truth in his eyes, even as my heart ached. The thought of him with her lingering like smoke in every corner of my home. I wondered how long this had been going on, how many quiet nights she had been in our kitchen, laughing over coffee while I believed I was sharing the warmth of friendship and love. And now I realized that friendship had been a mask, a cover for something that tore at the very foundation of my life. Emma came to me one morning with a question about her doll, a simple, innocent thing, and I felt the tenderness in her voice, a sharp contrast to the storm raging inside me. And I held her little hands and told her we would always have each other, always be safe and loved. And in that moment I realized that protecting them was more important than any revenge, more important than my own hurt. And I promised myself that I would not let them see the cracks in my heart, that the betrayal had made deep and open. I would stand tall, I would be steady, I would be the anchor that they could rely on, even if it meant swallowing the pain and carrying it like a secret weight in my chest. I began to notice the little patterns that had escaped me before, the messages, the whispers, the late nights out. I pieced together the timeline carefully, silently, like a detective moving through shadows. I watched the interactions, the texts that were meant to be hidden, and I began to understand the depth of the deceit. The casual way she would appear at family events, how Mark would excuse her presence as coincidence or necessity, and how I had believed him because I wanted to trust, because I had believed that love meant fidelity and honesty. And the betrayal cut deeper than anything I had known, cutting through the fabric of our lives like a knife through silk. One evening I decided to confront her, the courage building slowly inside me, a heat that had been suppressed by shock and grief. I called her and asked if she could meet me at a quiet cafe. We had been friends long enough to share stories of our lives over coffee and pastries, and I needed to see her face to understand that what I had imagined was real. I saw her sitting at a corner table, smiling, that same smile I had loved for years, but it was different now, harder, sharper, carrying the weight of things unspoken. I sat across from her and I tried to speak, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and sadness, and I asked the questions I had rehearsed for nights alone in my kitchen. She did not look away. She did not flinch. She answered honestly with a calmness that made my blood run cold, and I realized that she had no shame, no regret, only a twisted sense of justification and the knowledge that she had what she wanted. Mark and I fought that night at home, the argument a collision of years of trust and lies. His words defensive, mine raw and unfiltered. I told him that I had seen the messages, that I knew the truth, and that he could not hide behind excuses or apologies. I told him that he had not only betrayed me, but had betrayed the very idea of family, the security of our children. And his face fell, and in that moment I understood the depth of the wound we had created together. And yet, even as I spoke, I thought about Emma and Liam and how their eyes would search mine for comfort and safety. And I knew that I had to be strong. I started to make plans, slowly, carefully, the type of plans that were measured and deliberate. I consulted with a lawyer about our options, custody and protection, financial security, and I documented everything, quietly, recording the evidence without confrontation, letting the truth exist on paper and in photographs, so that when the time came, I would have the leverage I needed to protect myself and the children, and not for revenge, not for spite, but for safety and dignity, and to reclaim the life that had been stolen from me without consent. I also began to focus on the children more than ever before, noticing the little things, the small gestures that made them who they were. Emma drawing little sketches of our house in crayon, Liam practicing the piano with a careful persistence. I made sure that I was present at every moment, letting them feel the warmth of my attention, the love that had not been broken even if the adults around them were fractured. And I realized that in protecting them, I was protecting myself. I was giving myself a purpose, a reason to breathe and to move forward through the pain and the uncertainty. The days blended into weeks, and the tension in the house became a quiet hum. I moved through my mornings with ritual precision, making pancakes and scrambled eggs for the kids, walking Liam to school, holding Emma's hand while she chattered about butterflies and playground adventures. And each evening I would collapse into the living room chair and let the silence envelop me, letting the grief and anger and betrayal flow through me like a storm I could not contain but had to endure. I watched Mark in the background, moving through the house with a careful politeness that felt hollow and distant, and I knew that our marriage had shifted into something unrecognizable, something fragile that might never recover. And yet I carried on because the children could not see my despair, could not feel the fracture that ran through every corner of our lives. I began to notice the little lies, the small evasions that had once seemed trivial, now glaringly obvious. The phone hidden just a little too carefully, the text quickly closed when I entered the room, the way his eyes would dart away when I asked him a question about his day. I kept my calm. I kept my voice steady, while inside my mind raced with questions, with fear, with anger. And I realized that in order to survive, I had to move like water, flowing around obstacles, patient, deliberate, observant, and always careful to protect the children from the undercurrent of betrayal that threatened to pull us all under. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the cafe where I had met her weeks earlier. I had gone there not to see her again, but because I needed to confront my own feelings, to understand the rage that simmered inside me, and to give it a space where it could be acknowledged without consuming me. I sat at a corner table, watching the sunlight fall across empty chairs, imagining how it would feel if she were here, smiling across from me. And I felt a strange mix of anger and sorrow, a longing for the friend I thought I had known, and a deep mourning for the life I had lost, the life that would never return. And I knew that if I was to survive, I had to let some of that sorrow transform into clarity, into action. The confrontation with Mark became inevitable. One evening when the children were asleep, I asked him to sit with me in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had first seen them together, the room warm with the fading light of the day and the scent of vanilla from cookies I had baked earlier lingering in the air. And I told him that the time for excuses had ended, that I knew everything, and that I would no longer accept being complicit in a lie that was slowly destroying us. I told him that he had to make a choice not just for himself, but for the children, for the life we had built. And he looked at me with a mixture of fear and remorse, and I saw the man I had loved and the man I no longer trusted all in one fleeting expression. And I knew that the days ahead would test me in ways I could not yet imagine. I spent the following weeks gathering evidence, quietly observing interactions, recording conversations, keeping a careful log of messages and encounters. I documented everything with a precision born from necessity, not malice, preparing for the moment when truth could no longer be hidden, when the children's well-being required transparency and protection. I was meticulous in my approach, patient in my planning, aware of the delicate balance between exposing betrayal and maintaining the stability that my children needed to feel safe. In the evenings, I would lie awake, listening to the soft breaths of the children upstairs, imagining their dreams and wondering how much of the fractured adult world they would see and feel. And I realized that my role had shifted, that I was no longer just a wife, but a protector, a guide, a constant presence in the midst of chaos. And that while the betrayal had left scars, the care and attention I gave to Emma and Liam became a source of resilience and strength that anchored me in the reality that mattered most. One evening, as I walked through the living room, tidying up toys and books, I heard a knock at the door, and when I opened it, she was standing there, her expression unreadable, and I felt a surge of emotions, rage and grief and a strange exhaustion all at once. And I invited her in because I needed to hear her words, needed to see the truth from her own mouth. And she spoke calmly, with a sincerity that made my blood boil. And I listened, and I realized that some truths cannot be changed, cannot be undone, and that I had to decide how to carry myself forward, not for revenge, but for dignity, for the children, for the life that was still mine to reclaim. The confrontation left a residue that lingered for days, a quiet heaviness in the rooms we all shared. I moved through each morning with a careful balance between routine and vigilance, making sure that Emma and Liam's world remained intact, that breakfast was cheerful, that lunches were packed with little notes tucked inside, reminding them that they were loved and safe, and that the echo of betrayal did not follow them into school or playdates. I watched Mark carefully, measuring his words, his gestures polite and restrained, and I knew that the house had become a stage where every action was performed and every glance calculated. And yet, in the midst of it, I found a strange sense of control, a realization that while I could not undo what had been done, I could navigate the days ahead with patience and clarity. I began to reach out to friends, quietly, gathering support. People I trusted to listen without judgment, offering small truths and confidences that allowed me to unburden my heart. And in their voices I found validation for the storm I had endured, and strength I had not realized I possessed. They reminded me that the children would remember the way I held steady, the calm in my eyes, the assurance that despite the betrayal, their world was still filled with love. And I held on to that vision like a lifeline, knowing that the days ahead would require courage I had never had to summon before. There were mornings when I would wake early and sit with a cup of tea, watching the sunlight creep over the kitchen counters, thinking about the life that had been my own and the life that I was slowly building in its place. The silence of the house punctuated by the soft breaths of sleeping children, a reminder that they were still mine to protect and care for. And I began to find solace in these moments. The quiet before the day began, the ability to breathe and reflect and plan. And I realized that my strength was not in confrontation alone, but in the quiet accumulation of small acts of love and resilience that would shape the future for us all. The days when Mark and I spoke were careful, measured exchanges, full of unspoken tension. I learned to navigate the words between us, choosing what to say and what to withhold, crafting conversations that allowed for honesty without unnecessary hurt. And while the betrayal still hovered like a shadow, I began to notice small cracks in the facade he presented, the fleeting moments of remorse, the hesitation before speaking, the brief flashes of regret. And I understood that this too was part of the path forward, a delicate dance of boundaries and accountability that would protect the children while allowing space for truth to settle and for me to reclaim my dignity. I began to consider the practical steps that would ensure the safety and stability of our home for the children, the legal consultations, the financial planning, the careful organization of our schedules, all designed not to punish, but to preserve and protect. And I realized that in this meticulous preparation, I was not just surviving, I was asserting control over a life that had been fractured and uncertain. I was claiming a space where the children could thrive, and where I could find a sense of peace even amidst the chaos. One afternoon, I received a message from her simply stating that she wanted to talk, and I felt a flicker of anger tempered by exhaustion. And I agreed to meet, knowing that it was not for closure, for forgiveness, but to understand the person who had caused so much pain, and to give voice to the storm that had built inside me. And when we met in that quiet cafe, I listened as she spoke, her words measured, calm, unflinching. And I realized that her perspective could not change the past, could not erase the betrayal, but hearing her voice allowed me to place the story in its proper context, to separate the harm done from the life I was determined to rebuild. And I left the cafe with a sense of closure that came not from reconciliation, but from clarity. As the weeks passed, I focused even more intensely on the children, on their laughter, on their questions, on the small victories that marked their days. Emma mastering a new jump rope trick, Liam reading aloud with confidence. Their joy a counterpoint to the betrayal that had seeped into our lives. And I realized that my purpose was anchored in these moments, that my strength was measured in the calmness I could maintain in their presence, in the love I could give despite the fractures in the adult world. And I began to see that healing was possible, not because the past could be undone, but because the present could be shaped with intention and care. I remember the morning I decided that silence was no longer enough. The kids off at school and the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint chirping of birds outside. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where months ago I had first seen them together, and I felt the weight of every secret, every lie pressing against my chest, and I knew that I had to act, not from anger, but from necessity, to protect what was mine, to nurture and to ensure that the children could grow in a world where betrayal did not define them. I gathered the evidence, the messages, the photographs, the small details that proved the truth, and I organized it carefully. Every file, every note a testament to the reality I had endured and the boundaries I would no longer allow to be crossed. When I confronted Mark with the evidence, it was different this time. I did not shout or cry. I spoke with a calm precision that startled even me. I laid out everything I knew and everything I had documented, the patterns, the messages, the meetings, the way she had entered our lives under the guise of friendship, and he could not hide behind excuses or apologies this time. He looked at me and saw the certainty in my eyes, the resolve that had taken months to build. And for the first time, I felt a sense of power, not born from vengeance, but from clarity, from the knowledge that I was no longer a passive participant in the narrative that had been written without my consent. I was reclaiming my voice, my space, my dignity. I reached out to the children's teachers and close friends quietly, explaining that we were navigating a difficult time and asking for understanding and support. The responses were compassionate, and the small network of people who cared became a quiet anchor in the storm of our lives. I also sought guidance from counselors and support groups for parents who had faced infidelity and betrayal, learning from others who had walked similar paths, and finding in their experiences both empathy and strategies for preserving family stability and fostering healing in ways that would ensure Emma and Liam's lives continued to be filled with love and security. There were moments of doubt and exhaustion when I questioned whether I could maintain this balance, whether the weight of betrayal would crush me, or whether I could continue to provide a sense of normalcy for the children. I would sit at the edge of their beds at night, brushing Emma's hair or smoothing Liam's pajamas, and listen to their soft breaths. And I would remind myself that I was capable, that my love and presence mattered more than the fractures that existed around us. And slowly the anxiety and fear transformed into determination and a quiet resilience that I carried like a shield against the past. The day I finally spoke to her publicly, the woman who had been my best friend and had taken a place that was not hers, I did so with dignity and restraint. I did not shout. I did not humiliate. I spoke firmly and clearly about boundaries, about respect, about the consequences of her choices. And I saw the shock and discomfort in her eyes, and I realized that justice need not be dramatic. It need not be cruel. It could exist in the quiet assertion of truth and in the maintenance of one's own integrity. And I felt a sense of release that was deep and lasting, like a breath I had been holding for months, and I knew that the path forward was becoming clear. In the weeks that followed, Mark began to take a step back, acknowledging the reality of his actions and agreeing to the boundaries and structures I had put in place for the well-being of the children and for the stability of our home. We moved through the days cautiously, rebuilding trust in small increments, moments when he demonstrated accountability, when he was present fully in the children's lives, when his actions matched his words, and I observed carefully, knowing that my priority was not forgiveness, but the protection and nurturing of Emma and Liam, and the reestablishment of a home that was safe and predictable and filled with love. Evenings became my sanctuary, the soft light of the lamps casting long shadows across the walls, the children's laughter echoing from upstairs, the smell of dinner simmering in the kitchen, and I would pause in the quiet moments, reflecting on how far we had come, the journey from betrayal to stability, from anger to cautious peace, and I realized that the story of our lives had changed, not because the betrayal was erased, but because we had chosen to move forward with intention, with care, with love, and that in itself was a form of triumph that no deception could take from us. The truth slowly began to seep into the lives of those around us, not through gossip or drama, but through the quiet certainty that I carried in my voice, the steadiness in my actions, the way the children's routines remained intact despite the chaos that had threatened to consume our home. I noticed the subtle shifts in friends and family, the way they looked at me with a mixture of respect and concern, the way they offered help without judgment. And I realized that the betrayal no longer had the power to define us, that the narrative could be ours to shape, that the public consequences of truth could unfold naturally, without spectacle, simply through the dignity with which we lived our lives. Mark faced his own reckoning quietly and without spectacle. He took responsibility for the choices he had made, for the trust he had broken, and I observed as he worked to rebuild credibility, not with grand gestures or apologies repeated endlessly, but through consistency in action, through being present, through honoring the boundaries we had established. And I felt a cautious relief knowing that accountability was possible even in the most painful circumstances, that the consequences of betrayal could be real without being cruel, that the children could witness accountability and responsibility without being burdened by adult conflict. The woman who had once been my friend existed in our periphery like a shadow. I encountered her occasionally at community events or through indirect interactions, yet the power she had once held over my life had diminished. She was aware of the boundaries I had set, the documentation I had gathered, and the careful measures I had put in place to protect myself and the children. And I felt a quiet triumph, not born of vengeance, but from the recognition that the truth had a gravity of its own, that it did not need embellishment or confrontation to assert its presence, and that my steadfastness had created a shield that preserved what mattered most. I spent the following months focusing on rebuilding our routines and the small joys that made our family life vibrant and resilient. The smell of pancakes in the morning, the sound of Liam's piano practice, the small drawings Emma would leave on the kitchen counter for me to find. I reveled in these moments and allowed myself to feel pride in the way we had navigated the storm. The sense of control and agency that had been stolen from me had been reclaimed through patience and deliberate action. And I recognized that healing was not a singular event, but a continuous process of attentiveness, love, and resilience. I also devoted time to my own reflection and personal growth, acknowledging the pain and betrayal while seeking ways to transform it into strength and insight. I wrote in journals describing my emotions, my fears, my hopes for the future, and I sought counsel from friends and mentors who provided perspective and guidance. And in doing so, I found a clarity that allowed me to approach our daily life with both firmness and compassion, understanding that I could hold space for the children's innocence, while also maintaining vigilance over the truths I had uncovered. There were nights when I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange, the air cool and fragrant, and I would allow myself to breathe deeply, feeling the weight of months slowly lifting from my shoulders. I reflected on the journey from shock to awareness to confrontation to protection, and I understood that the public consequences of betrayal were not always dramatic or explosive. They could exist quietly in the way one moves through life with integrity and courage, and that those who had caused harm could encounter their own reckonings without me having to orchestrate them. And in these quiet, reflective moments, I also acknowledged the resilience of the children, the way they had adapted to the shifting dynamics, the laughter that returned to the rooms, the small victories of school performances and bedtime stories completed without tension. I recognized that the home we had rebuilt was a testament not only to my endurance, but to the inherent capacity of love and care to withstand even the deepest breaches of trust, and that the moral arc of our story was shaped not by revenge, but by intentional action, protection, and unwavering presence. As the months passed, I began to notice a subtle transformation within myself, a quiet strength that had been forged in the fire of betrayal and heartbreak. I no longer felt the constant ache of suspicion or the sharp pangs of anger. Every moment of my day was no longer consumed by what had been taken from me, but instead guided by what I could protect and nurture. The children became the center of my world, their laughter, their questions, their small hands in mine, reminding me that love could endure even when trust had been broken. I focused on creating moments of joy for them, baking cookies together on Saturday mornings, reading bedtime stories with exaggerated voices that made them giggle until they wrinkled their noses, and their smiles became the anchor I clung to when shadows of the past threatened to resurface. Mark and I established new boundaries, carefully and deliberately. We spoke less about the past and more about the present, about routines, about schedules, about the children and their happiness. The tension that had once hovered in the air began to shift into a cautious equilibrium. He showed up for school events, he helped with homework, he attended doctor's appointments. And though I remained vigilant, I also allowed small glimmers of trust to take root, understanding that trust could not be demanded or rushed, but had to be rebuilt through consistent action and presence. And I watched as he slowly recognized the consequences of his choices, the weight of guilt reflected in quiet actions rather than words, and I felt a cautious sense of hope for the first time in months. I devoted more energy to my own passions, to reclaim the parts of myself that had been overshadowed by the betrayal and the endless planning to protect the children. I returned to writing and poured my emotions into words, capturing the rawness of pain, the resilience of love, the clarity of purpose that had emerged from the chaos. And in these moments, I found a catharsis, a gentle release of what I had carried for so long, a reminder that even in the midst of heartbreak, one could find voice, one could find identity, and that creativity could transform anguish into something beautiful and lasting. The woman who had once been my best friend became a distant memory, though the wound she caused remained a reminder. I learned to speak her name without tremor, without rage, acknowledging the reality without giving it power over my present. The social consequences had settled quietly. She understood the boundaries she had crossed, and we all moved forward without the drama of confrontation, simply through the authority of lived truth. And I felt a sense of liberation in knowing that dignity and calmness could carry more weight than anger, and that life could continue with integrity even when betrayal had once threatened to define it. Weekends became sacred, our little rituals restored and deepened. We hiked in the nearby parks, Emma skipping ahead and turning back with giggles, Liam carrying his backpack and pretending to lead us through forests of imagination, the smells of fresh pine and wet earth grounding us in the reality of each other and the presence of life surrounding us. And I found a joy in the mundane, in the ordinary, in the repeated gestures that reinforced stability and security for the children. And in those moments, I could almost forget the pain of the past and instead feel gratitude for the resilience that had carried us through. I also learned the subtle art of forgiveness, not for them, not for Mark, not even for her, but for myself, to release the constant tension of resentment and to allow my mind to rest, to allow the children to feel a mother who was calm, who was strong, who could navigate challenges with grace and patience. And I realized that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It did not mean condoning it. It meant choosing to no longer let the pain dictate my present and my future. And I felt a lightness that had been absent for so long, a quiet opening in the chest where grief had once throbbed. Evenings were my sanctuary, where I would sit with a cup of tea, listening to the soft sounds of the children sleeping, their gentle breaths a rhythm that reminded me of the life we were rebuilding. And I reflected on the journey, from betrayal to action to healing, from shock to clarity to resolution, and I realized that the path had been slow, deliberate, painful, and necessary, each step carrying a lesson in resilience, patience, and self-respect. And I understood that those scars remained, they were part of the story, a story that now included triumph and endurance, and love that persisted even when trust had been shattered. The mornings began to feel lighter. I woke to the sound of birds outside my window and the smell of toast drifting from the kitchen. Emma bounding into my room with her curly hair wild and eyes bright, and Liam dragging his blanket behind him with a sleepy grin. And in those moments, I felt the quiet joy that had once been overshadowed by betrayal and secrecy. I moved through my days with intention, choosing to notice the small victories, the laughter that returned to the house, the way the children's curiosity blossomed. And I realized that the fabric of our lives was being rewoven stitch by careful stitch through love, presence, and patience. And that though the past could not be erased, its power over us had diminished in the warmth of ordinary moments. Mark and I had reached a point of careful coexistence, a measured respect where our interactions were guided by honesty, accountability, and the shared responsibility of parenthood. I observed him stepping into roles he had neglected before, the weight of betrayal still present but tempered by awareness and effort. And I allowed myself to see that change was possible, even when brokenness seemed absolute. That the adults around me could learn from mistakes and that the children could grow, witnessing the restoration of integrity and stability rather than the lingering chaos of unaddressed deceit. And in these glimpses, I felt relief and a cautious hope that we could navigate forward together without repeating the errors of the past. I devoted more time to myself, reclaiming passions that had been sidelined in the turmoil, spending afternoons writing and reflecting, and connecting with friends who had remained steadfast, a quiet network of support and encouragement that reminded me I was not alone, and that the world beyond our home held opportunities for growth and fulfillment. And in these moments, I realized that self-care was not indulgent. It was essential for maintaining the strength and clarity needed to continue protecting the children and nurturing the life we were reconstructing, and that personal growth could coexist with the responsibilities of motherhood. Weekends became a canvas for new memories, hikes through the local trails with the crisp smell of pine and damp earth under our shoes, picnics in the park with blankets spread under the open sky, Emma laughing as she chased squirrels and Liam pretending to be a forest explorer, leading us to imaginary treasures. And I felt the sense of normalcy and wonder returning to our lives, the children learning through play that the world was still safe, that love could endure and flourish. And I found comfort and joy in being the anchor that held them steady while guiding them through the echoes of what had been broken. The woman who had once been my best friend became an infrequent presence in the periphery of our lives. I acknowledged her existence without giving it emotional weight, understanding that her role in our story had ended, and that the authority I had reclaimed through patience, evidence, and deliberate action allowed me to maintain boundaries with confidence and grace. I realized that true power was not in retaliation or anger, but in calm assertion of truth, in protecting what mattered most, and in choosing to move forward with dignity, despite the scars of betrayal and the memories of what had once threatened to undo us. Evenings were often my time for reflection. I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the quiet sounds of the neighborhood and the faint hum of the city beyond. And I allowed myself to feel gratitude for resilience, for the lessons learned, for the strength that had emerged in the midst of heartbreak. I considered the journey from discovery to action to healing, understanding that each phase had been necessary, that the anger, the grief, the planning, and the confrontation had been part of a process that now allowed me to inhabit a space of peace and clarity, where the children's laughter could coexist with my own sense of calm and accomplishment. I also recognized that the moral of the journey was not vengeance, but empowerment and love that endured and flourished despite adversity, that integrity and patience could outlast deceit, and that by protecting those who depended on me, I was nurturing the very essence of what had been endangered by betrayal. And I felt a quiet pride, knowing that the children would grow, witnessing strength, grace, and resilience modeled in real life, and that our story could now be one of survival, recovery, and enduring love, rather than one defined solely by heartbreak and loss. The home became a sanctuary once more, rooms filled with laughter and warmth, routines restored, and new traditions formed, small gestures like Sunday pancakes and bedtime stories becoming the threads that wove a sense of continuity and safety for the children. And in these ordinary moments, I found extraordinary peace, knowing that life could continue in a meaningful way, that betrayal had not claimed the whole story, that the future was still ours to shape, and that resilience and love could transform even the deepest wounds into foundations for a life renewed. As the seasons changed, I watched the children grow with a quiet amazement, Emma's curiosity blossoming into careful observation of the world around her, Liam's imagination becoming more vivid with each passing day. And in their eyes, I saw a reflection of the stability and love I had fought to preserve. I noticed how they laughed more freely, how their questions were filled with wonder and not fear, how bedtime stories became shared adventures rather than a refuge from tension. And I realized that the most profound victories were not measured in confrontation or drama, but in the subtle shifts of trust and security that made our home a place of warmth and consistency again. Mark and I navigated our new dynamic with careful respect. I maintained boundaries, he honored them, and slowly the tension between us softened into a mutual understanding that our priorities were the children and the life we were building rather than our unresolved past. I observed his actions closely, noting the consistent effort he made to show up in ways that mattered to Emma and Liam, the way he listened more attentively, the way he spoke with care, and I allowed myself to acknowledge that people could change if given the opportunity, and that accountability and effort could slowly rebuild trust even after profound betrayal, and that my role was to guide this process with discernment and clarity. I spent long afternoons writing and reflecting on the journey I had endured, the shock of discovery, the anguish of betrayal, the careful orchestration of protection for the children, the deliberate actions taken to reclaim my voice and my dignity, and I realized that each step had forged resilience and a deep understanding of myself. I documented my thoughts, not to dwell on the past, but to capture the lessons learned, the strategies that had worked, and the emotional growth that had emerged from pain. And in doing so, I felt a sense of mastery over a chapter of life that had once threatened to overwhelm me. The woman who had been my friend, and then my rival, faded further from our daily consciousness. I encountered her rarely and without drama, and I understood that the power she once held over my life had dissipated because I had chosen to center my energy on what truly mattered: the children, the home, the rebuilding of trust, and the cultivation of peace. And I realized that control was not about domination or revenge, but about presence and consistency, about creating a life that could withstand interference and flourish despite past wounds. And I felt a quiet pride in the autonomy and authority I had reclaimed over my own narrative. Weekends became a sanctuary for family rituals. Emma skipping ahead on the trails and laughing at her own shadow, Liam pretending to discover hidden treasures while I carried blankets and snacks, the air filled with earthy scents and the soft sounds of nature surrounding us, the rhythm of our steps and the shared joy of ordinary adventures, reminding me that life's beauty was found in continuity and presence rather than in extraordinary events. And I savored each smile, each laugh, each word spoken with innocence, knowing that these moments were the true indicators of recovery and resilience. Evenings were a time for introspection and gratitude. The children asleep upstairs, I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, feeling the cool air against my skin, listening to the distant hum of life beyond our home, and allowing myself to reflect on the journey we had traversed, the intensity of betrayal, the careful navigation of truth, the intentional cultivation of stability, and the restoration of love and trust. And I felt a deep sense of accomplishment and peace in knowing that we had endured not by avoiding pain, but by facing it with courage and choosing love and protection as our guiding principles. I also reflected on the lessons that betrayal had taught me about human nature, about trust, about boundaries, and about the capacity for resilience. I understood that the moral of this journey was not vengeance, but wisdom and strength, that one could survive profound betrayal and still emerge with integrity, that one could protect the vulnerable and cultivate growth while navigating pain, and that true empowerment lay in the choices made in the aftermath of heartbreak and in the intentional creation of a life filled with love, respect, and stability. The months that followed carried a rhythm of quiet healing and steady rebuilding. I watched the children thrive in ways that filled me with a deep sense of satisfaction. Emma's laughter ringing through the house as she practiced new songs on her small keyboard, Liam's focus sharpening as he built intricate Lego creations, each piece carefully aligned with precision and imagination. And in these small victories, I recognized the tangible fruits of my persistence, the ordinary moments that signaled extraordinary resilience, that despite betrayal and disruption, our family could flourish and find joy again. Mark and I maintained a delicate balance between accountability and co-parenting, boundaries clear and consequences understood. But the atmosphere gradually softened with time. Through consistent effort and deliberate action, he began to demonstrate a renewed commitment to the children, their needs, and to the home we had worked so hard to stabilize. And I acknowledged that change was possible, that people could take responsibility in tangible ways, and that the energy I invested in vigilance was now being rewarded by incremental gestures of reliability, presence, and awareness that supported both the children and my own sense of security and dignity. I devoted more time to my own passions to restore a sense of identity that had been overshadowed by betrayal and the daily work of protection. Writing becoming a vessel for processing emotions, reflecting on lessons learned, and envisioning a future not defined by deceit but by intentional choice and self-expression. And in these moments, I felt the quiet power of reclaiming my narrative, the ability to assert agency over my life, and to cultivate a space where the children and I could thrive unencumbered by past wounds or lingering resentment. And I recognized that my resilience had become both shield and compass, guiding our way forward. The woman who had once been my friend now existed only in the distant margins of my awareness. I encountered her rarely and without emotional turmoil, understanding that her influence had ended not through confrontation or spectacle, but through deliberate boundaries, measured responses, and the unshakable consistency of presence that protected the children and preserved my dignity. And I felt a deep sense of freedom in knowing that power could be claimed through calm determination and integrity rather than drama or revenge, and that life could continue unburdened by her intrusion. Weekends and family time became sacred rituals, hikes in the woods, the smell of pine and damp leaves underfoot, the warmth of shared blankets and snacks, laughter echoing through the open air, Emma and Liam discovering treasures in imaginary forests. The beauty of ordinary moments underscoring the healing that had taken root, and I allowed myself to savor each interaction, to notice the details, to appreciate the stability that had been so hard-won, and to witness the children learning that love could endure despite adult failings, that home could remain a sanctuary even after trust had been broken. Evenings remained a reflective practice. A cup of tea in hand, I would sit on the porch, listening to the soft sounds of life around our home, the distant hum of cars, the faint calls of night birds, the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind, and I allowed myself to acknowledge the journey we had traveled, the path from shock to discovery to action to healing, and the realization that the moral of this story was not vengeance, but the cultivation of resilience, integrity, and love that endured and strengthened under pressure, and that the children could witness and internalize these lessons in ways that would shape their understanding of trust, family, and personal strength. I also recognized the subtle but profound transformation within myself, the quiet strength forged through months of navigating betrayal and pain, the ability to move forward with grace, to protect the vulnerable, to assert boundaries and maintain dignity, and the realization that true empowerment was not found in retaliation, but in the deliberate, steady work of rebuilding and nurturing a life that could withstand adversity and flourish, and that the scars left behind were not signs of weakness, but markers of survival, wisdom, and endurance. And so, our home found a new rhythm, a delicate harmony that balanced accountability and healing. The laughter of children filling rooms once heavy with tension, the smell of meals cooked and shared, the warmth of routine, and the quiet joy of ordinary adventures, weaving a narrative of resilience and love that had endured the fractures of betrayal and emerged intact and stronger. And in these moments, I understood fully that the story of our lives was no longer defined solely by loss and deception, but by courage, patience, and the steadfast cultivation of hope and restoration. The stability we had worked so hard to reclaim became a gentle rhythm in our days, a rhythm marked by small victories. Emma learning new songs on the keyboard and humming them proudly as she twirled around the living room, Liam presenting his Lego creations with meticulous attention to every detail, and the sound of their laughter filling the spaces that had once been heavy with tension and disbelief. And I felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the ordinary routines we had rebuilt were more powerful than any grand gesture that could have erased the betrayal or forced closure for us all. Mark continued to navigate the consequences of his choices with measured accountability, and I observed him quietly, showing up in ways that mattered, consistently honoring boundaries, being present for the children, and participating in routines with a newfound awareness of the trust that had been broken and the work required to rebuild it. And in this cautious evolution, I realized that people could change if guided by responsibility and clarity, that the choices they made in daily life reflected their understanding of accountability, and that the slow accumulation of consistent effort could shift even the most fractured relationships into a functional and cooperative space. I devoted more time to writing and personal reflection, pouring emotions into words, capturing the journey from betrayal to action to restoration. The shock of discovering my best friend as my husband's mistress, the careful orchestration of protection for the children, the meticulous gathering of evidence, and the deliberate confrontation and boundaries I had established. And in doing so, I realized that documenting the story allowed me to assert control over the narrative, to transform chaos into clarity and pain into understanding, and that this creative practice became a refuge and a source of personal empowerment amidst the ongoing responsibilities of motherhood. The woman who had once been my friend faded from my daily thoughts, existing only as a distant reminder of the choices that had led to our fractured months. I encountered her rarely and always without the weight of emotional turmoil, understanding that her influence over our lives had dissipated through measured action, the consistent protection of my children, and the careful cultivation of boundaries and respect for myself and the life I was rebuilding. And I felt a deep sense of liberation, knowing that dignity and intentional action had replaced anger and resentment, and that the narrative of our lives was now ours to shape. Weekends became a sanctuary for exploration and shared experiences. The children and I hiking along wooded trails, the smell of damp pine needles in the air, and the sound of leaves crunching under our feet. Emma collecting colorful stones and arranging them in her pocket. Liam imagining grand adventures and guiding us with earnest determination. And in these ordinary yet magical moments, I found the deepest sense of restoration, understanding that the joy, curiosity, and laughter of my children were the truest measure of recovery, and that the resilience I had cultivated allowed me to provide them with a safe and nurturing environment. Evenings offered a quiet space for reflection. I would sit on the porch with a warm cup of tea, listening to the subtle chorus of night sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of passing cars, and I allowed myself to contemplate the months that had passed, the intensity of betrayal, the careful steps I had taken to protect and nurture the children, the slow reclamation of my voice and dignity. And I understood that the story had evolved from one of pain and confusion into one of resilience, agency, and enduring love. That the moral of our journey was not vengeance, but steadfastness, clarity, and the deliberate choice to protect those who depended on me. I recognized within myself a profound transformation, a quiet but unshakable strength that had emerged from months of navigating heartbreak and betrayal, a capacity to hold both firmness and compassion simultaneously, to protect the innocent while demanding accountability, to assert boundaries while allowing for measured reconciliation, and to understand that empowerment was not in reaction or retaliation, but in the steady, deliberate cultivation of stability, dignity, and care that allowed both myself and the children to thrive. And in those moments of quiet reflection, I saw the fullness of what we had built, a home once fractured, now filled with laughter, warmth, and predictability, routines restored and enriched with small rituals, Sunday pancakes, bedtime stories, hikes, shared meals, all forming a tapestry of ordinary magic. And in that tapestry, I saw the resilience of love, the power of patience, and the triumph of deliberate action over chaos and betrayal. And I realized that our story had shifted from being defined by loss and deception to being a testament to courage, endurance, and the quiet but unwavering strength of a mother's love. The weeks that followed were quiet but full of life. Emma and Liam's laughter became the rhythm of my days, the sound of their footsteps running through the house, the excited chatter at the breakfast table, the soft whispered secrets at bedtime. And I realized that this ordinary music of family life was the deepest form of restoration that could exist. I no longer measured victory in confrontation or punishment, but in these small, steady moments where love and stability had returned, and where the children felt safe and cherished despite everything that had come before. Mark had settled into a pattern of accountability. His actions aligned with words. He showed up consistently for the children, helped with homework, attended events without complaint, and I observed him with a cautious sense of understanding that change was possible, that accountability could be enacted quietly and steadily, and that the children's perception of consistency and care mattered more than adult resentments or past betrayals. And I allowed myself to feel relief in knowing that our shared responsibility could be honored without drama, without spectacle, but with a clear commitment to what truly mattered. I devoted more time to myself, nurturing the parts of my life that had been overshadowed by months of crisis. I wrote and reflected, poured my thoughts onto paper, capturing the arc of betrayal, discovery, confrontation, and healing. And in this process, I realized that reclaiming my voice had been as essential as protecting the children. That creativity and introspection were powerful forms of agency that could transform pain into understanding and resilience, and that personal growth could coexist with parental responsibility in ways that enriched both the children's lives and my own. The woman who had once been my best friend existed only in the distant periphery of my mind. Her influence over our lives dissipated by boundaries, vigilance, and deliberate action. I met her once or twice in social settings, but her presence carried no emotional weight for me anymore. And I realized that the power she had held was not in her actions alone, but in the absence of my boundaries. And in reclaiming my authority, my calm, and my decisiveness, I had rendered her intrusion powerless. And in this, I found an unexpected freedom, a lightness that came not from revenge, but from clarity and intentional living. Our weekends became sanctuaries of ordinary magic. Hikes in the forest, the smell of pine needles and damp earth under our shoes, Emma collecting stones and arranging them meticulously, Liam leading us on imaginary quests, the children's joy and curiosity a constant reminder that life's restoration is built in small, shared moments. And I allowed myself to savor the ordinary adventures, the quiet dinners, the shared chores, the bedtime stories told with exaggerated voices. And I saw the children learning that love and safety could endure even after betrayal, that routines and rituals could form the foundation of security and happiness, and that resilience was something tangible and visible in the life we had rebuilt. Evenings were my time to reflect, to sit quietly on the porch with tea in hand, listening to the night air, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant hum of life beyond our home, and I contemplated how far we had come, the journey from shock to discovery to confrontation to healing, from chaos to clarity to stability. And I understood that the moral of our story was not vengeance, but resilience, patience, integrity, and the deliberate, steady cultivation of love and care that allowed both the children and myself to thrive. I saw clearly the transformation within myself, the quiet strength that had been forged through months of navigating betrayal and heartbreak, the ability to hold firm boundaries while showing compassion, the capacity to protect without anger, the insight that empowerment is found in action, consistency, and love, rather than retaliation. And I felt a sense of pride in the person I had become, in the mother I had been for Emma and Liam, and in the calm, enduring love that now filled our home. And so, our story ended not with drama, but with quiet triumph. A home restored, a life rebuilt, a family strengthened by resilience and love. And I understood fully that though the scars of betrayal would always remain, they were now part of a larger narrative of endurance, care, and unwavering commitment to what truly mattered: the children's well-being, our stability, and the moral clarity of living with dignity and intentionality. And I felt a deep, enduring peace in knowing that we had survived, we had grown, and that the best parts of life were still ahead. Would you have done the same if it were you to navigate betrayal and rebuild a life for the ones you love? Tell me in the comments, and remember to subscribe for more stories of resilience, love, and courage that prove that even in the darkest moments, there is a path forward.